Often when I speak, the press want to talk about the tragedy of the day. They want to talk about terrorism. They want to talk about weapons of mass destruction. They want to talk about emerging infections. So one reporter one day made a mistake in a room filled like this and said to me, "Surgeon General, what's the most pressing issue before you today?" And I said, "Obesity." And I said to them, they said, "Why do you say that?" I said, "Because obesity is the terror within."
This video isn't about obesity, because the real terror within is a silent malnourishment that keeps us stuck in survival mode. It's invisible, overlooked, and misunderstood. We'll look at how some of history's deadliest diseases weren't truly eradicated, just renamed, and why real health and nutrition will always stay buried beneath the noise of modern life, unless you learn how to see what no one's pointing to. If you walk into a modern supermarket today, it kind of feels like a victory. A place of abundance. Bright lights, clean aisles, shelves stacked with colorful boxes and packages that promise convenience, pleasure, maybe even health. And most people don't question it. Why would they? Everything on those shelves had to pass thorough regulations, certifications, safety checks. There's this quiet assumption: if it's being sold, it must be fine, right? There's even a broader cultural attitude baked in, the idea that food is food. As long as it fills you up, it counts. Calories in, hunger out, no need to overthink it. But what if that's not true? What if the system, the one we trust to filter out what's dangerous and highlight what's essential, is just incomplete? Or worse, misleading? Because to really understand nutrition, to grasp how specific nutrients can mean the difference between life and death, we need to look back, way back, to a time where people were dying not from poisons, but from what they weren't getting. Let's talk about a disease that haunted the early 20th century, Pellagra. It was known for the 4 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. It devastated poor communities worldwide, especially where people lived almost entirely on corn-based diets. In the American South, in orphanages, prisons, and mental institutions, the symptoms were everywhere. Thousands were misdiagnosed with schizophrenia or insanity. But the thing is, they weren't crazy. Their brains were starving. And while that was happening, something quietly revolutionary was unfolding up north in Wisconsin, where a dairy chemist named Stephen Moulton Babcock had been paying close attention to something most people ignored. Farmers were noticing that animals fed on different grains, even ones that look similar in protein, fat, and carbohydrate content, were experiencing dramatically different health outcomes. At the time, the dominant belief in nutrition was simple. As long as you had enough macros, carbs, fats, and proteins, and enough calories, you were fine. That's what people believed back then. In fact, a 1907 textbook of nutrition didn't even mention the word vitamin. It just wasn't on anyone's radar. But Babcock wasn't convinced. He'd heard too many reports from farmers whose livestock deteriorated on certain feeds, so in 1910 he launched a bold experiment, in a barn of all places, with the help of 3 colleagues from the University of Wisconsin. The design was simple. He split cows into 4 groups. One group was fed only corn, another only wheat, a third only oats, and the fourth got a mixed grain diet. But everything else stayed the same: housing, water, care, and of course the results were shocking. The corn-fed cows didn't just survive, they thrived. They gave more milk, richer milk, and had healthier calves. And yeah, now, I said corn's bad for humans earlier, but that's not a contradiction, because cows aren't built like us. They've got 4 stomachs. We don't. The wheat-fed and oat-fed cows, on the other hand, saw their health deteriorate, and by the time their second calves were born, the real cause was clear. Those calves were stillborn. Despite appearing nutritionally identical on paper, the grains produced radically different outcomes, not just for the cows, but for the next generation. Something critical was present in corn that wheat and oats lacked, and whatever it wasn't listed in any textbook. It was one of the first cracks in the old model. Nutrition wasn't just about calories and macros anymore. Something else was in food. something vital that made the difference between life and death, fertility and failure, nourishment and silent starvation. And around the same time, over in Asia, doctors were battling a strange and devastating disease called beriberi. It caused weakness, nerve damage, confusion, and often death. No one knew what caused it, but in 1912 a Polish chemist named Casimir Funk isolated a compound that cured it. That compound turned out to be thiamine, or vitamin B1. Funk gave this new class of nutrients a name, vitamins, short for vital amines. Amines are simple nitrogen-based compounds which he thought all these nutrients had, but that part turned out to be wrong, because not all of them are amines. Though the name stuck, and eventually we just dropped the E and ended up with vitamin. Soon scientists discovered that these mystery compounds weren't just one thing, but a whole group of essential nutrients, some dissolved in water and others in fat. The fat-soluble ones turned out to be vitamin A, D, E, and K, and the water-soluble group became the B complex, B1, B2, B3, B6, B12, and more. So this wasn't just a new chapter in science, it was a complete rewrite, because nutrition wasn't just about energy anymore. There were invisible substances in food that made the difference between health and disease, sanity and psychosis, between life and death, and every major lab around the world joined the race to find them. Meanwhile, down south, people were still dying of pellagra. In 1914, the US Surgeon General asked Dr. Joseph Goldberger to investigate the pellagra epidemic which had exploded in the South since 1906. By 1912, South Carolina alone had over 30,000 cases with a death rate nearing 40%. Many believed it was caused by infection, bad genes, or miasma from poor hygiene. But Goldberger noticed something nobody else had. Doctors and nurses treating pellagra patients weren't getting sick. Of course, that observation sparked radical theories. What if it wasn't infectious at all? What if it was dietary? He dug deeper and patterns emerged, of course. Pellagra struck the poor hardest, especially African Americans and sharecroppers. Their diets revolved around three staples: cornmeal, molasses, and pork fat. Very little fresh food, hardly any variety. And you might ask yourself, okay, what about the doctors and nurses? Well, of course, we're eating elsewhere. Goldberger began testing his theory in orphanages by changing the diet of over 300 children, introducing fresh meat, milk, eggs, and in a matter of weeks, new cases stopped, and the sick ones recovered. So then he repeated the same approach at the Georgia State Sanitarium, the South's largest mental institution, this time with control groups. Half the patients received the original corn-based diet, the other half got the improved one. The results? Well, the control group got sicker and the experimental group got healthier. In fact, so healthy that many were discharged from the asylum entirely. But then funding dried up and the institutions reverted to their old diets and the pellagra returned, of course. Goldberger needed stronger proof, something so undeniable it would silence his critics. So in 1915, he did something really bold. He got permission from the governor of Mississippi to run a human experiment on prisoners with pardons as an incentive. 11 healthy men were put on a carefully monitored nutrient-poor corn-based diet for 9 months. By the 6th month, 5 had full-blown pellagra, and the rest were showing early symptoms. The prisoners were in agony, no doubt about it, and some even begged to leave the study, but were denied. Imagine. It wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a slow-motion disaster unfolding in real time under strict observation. And still, believe it or not, people resisted. Goldberger's findings were a direct threat to the Southern status quo, and his discovery wasn't just scientific, it was political. It suggested that poverty, not germs, were killing people, that the South's reliance on cheap, monotonous diets was the real culprit. Southern leaders were furious, and many refused to accept the idea that this was a man-made crisis. Imagine a northern doctor accusing the region's economy and policies. It was too much. So Goldberger was desperate, and by 1916 he had already shown that pellagra wasn't contagious, at least not in the way people thought. Of course, no one listened. So the medical community was still convinced it was caused by a germ. And in one final attempt to silence his critics once and for all, he did something extreme. He injected blood from pellagra patients into himself, his assistant, and even his wife. He swabbed their noses, mouths, and open wounds with saliva, urine, feces, and even skin scabs from the sick. I should have said even feces, because that's even... Anyways. They called them the filth parties. It was grotesque, but intentional. If pellagra were infectious, someone should have gotten sick. No one did. At most, some volunteers got nausea or diarrhea, but no pellagra. Still, critics dismissed the experiment. They said most of the volunteers were men, and since pellagra was more common in women, the results didn't count. It was a weak excuse, of course, but it kept the old terriers alive. Goldberger did manage to prove that pellagra was caused by a poor diet, especially one lacking in fresh foods and protein, but he never really discovered the exact missing nutrient, because that would come later in 1937, long after Goldberger's death, when Konrad Olweim finally identified the missing link, niacin, or vitamin B3. So pellagra was caused by a deficiency in niacin and sometimes tryptophan, an amino acid that the body can convert into niacin, though this conversion is very limited and depends on many factors. Anyway, his discovery built on earlier research from the 1920s when Babcock's colleague Elmer McCollum shifted the rat experiments and isolated several vitamins, including vitamin A and key B-complex components. The government moved quickly, fortifying flour and cereals with niacin and other B vitamins, and pellagra cases dropped and the epidemic was declared over, or so it seemed. It's important to note that niacin doesn't just prevent pellagra, it also helps lower LDL cholesterol, raise HDL, reduce triglyceride levels, support circulation, which can benefit people dealing with erectile dysfunction, and it's a cofactor for iodine metabolism. By the way, if you're curious about iodine, I've got a full video on that, check the description. One thing that definitely won't go unnoticed with niacin is the flush. I know some people hate it, but I actually enjoy it. It usually starts with a warm wave across the face or chest, followed by flushed skin, a prickly heat, and sometimes a bit of tingling, itching, or even a burning sensation. But don't panic, it's totally harmless and passes quickly. For me, to be honest, it's calming. I like to snuggle in bed when it happens because despite the warmth, it sometimes gives me chills, so it takes the edge off and occasionally even gives my mood a little boost. What's actually happening is simple. Niacin causes the tiny blood vessels just under the skin to dilate, and that's what makes your skin feel warm and look red. So taking it with food obviously can tone it down a bit, and yeah, you might do that. Anyway, here's the part nobody really wants to talk about. Pellagra never really went away. Sure, the extreme version, the textbook version, is rare now, but that's mostly due to fortification. And remember, that's not generosity, that's just damage control, because subclinical deficiency, the kind that messes with your skin, your energy, your brain, your mood, is still everywhere. And it shows up as fatigue, brain fog, anxiety, digestive issues, poor sleep, low resilience, symptoms we brush off and medicate and just accept as normal. Nutrition in our modern world has been buried under noise, and our endless diets, contradictory advice, food pyramids that change every decade, influencers, plant-based meats full of seed oils and God knows what, and underneath it all, a system that doesn't really want you to know how much it actually costs to thrive, because here's the uncomfortable truth. Thriving isn't cheap. Almost everything we've been taught about food has been flipped. They convinced us that nutrient-dense food like beef, eggs, butter are dangerous, while ultra-processed garbage gets labeled heart healthy. People think beef is expensive because it's bad for you and the government cares, when in reality it's the most nutrient-dense food we have, and the cost reflects its value, not a danger. That's not just misinformation, that's weaponized confusion. And most people aren't lazy or stupid, they are overwhelmed. Our society isn't just full of temptations, it's a maze of deliberate deceptions. From front label lies to fake food pyramids, everything is designed to confuse you. So, if you want to be healthy today, you really have to educate yourself and unlearn half of what you've been told, because it's not just about eating better, of course. It's about surviving a system that profits when you're sick, tired, and addicted. We live in a world where income is calculated to keep most people surviving, not flourishing. No matter where you live, the cost of real health, clean food, nutrients, rest, peace of mind is rising. And the longer we pretend it's all fine because it's FDA approved or fortified, the more we stay trapped in a system that confuses survival for success. Thanks for watching.